in African American and Diaspora Studies at UNC Chapel Hill. Kia.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kia Caldwell. I'm a professor of African American, and Diaspora Studies at UNC Chapel Hill, and I'm happy to be co-moderating this session today.
It is our privilege to welcome you to our panel discussion today, our webinar, which, as you already know, is called Saving the House We Built: African Americans, Democracy, and the Attack on the U.S. Capitol. We have over 500 people registered for this webinar shortly after it being announced. And so we thank you all for joining us wherever you are and participating in this discussion. This panel grew out of a conversation between Kia and I a couple weeks ago. Like most Americans, particularly those of us of African descent, we were both incensed but not surprised by the attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. We all remember what happened that day as thousands of protesters stormed the United States Capitol on orders by the President of the United States. They were determined to overturn the results of a presidential election that Democrat Joe Biden won fair and square, and to proclaim that Donald Trump, the rightful loser, having been duly elected to a second term, despite losing the popular vote by more than 7 million and the Electoral College by a margin of 74 electoral votes. As part of their failed coup d'etat, these terrorists breached the Capitol's security and were prepared to take hostages. This was the first time that the Capitol had been attacked en masse since the War of 1812, when the British invaded and burned Washington. They engaged in grossly uncivilized acts, including breaking into offices, defecating on floors, constructing gallows outside and tying a noose to it, occupying, vandalizing, and looting the building, assaulting Capitol police officers. And they made clear their intent to take hostages and cause harm to lawmakers, including, but not limited to, Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Mike Pence, the Republican vice president elected from their own party, and members of Congress, including, but not limited to, progressives in the Democratic Party. Many people were alarmed, shocked. You heard all kinds of rhetoric. This is not who we are. This is un-American. This is unpatriotic. This is undemocratic. But for Black Americans, by and large, the response was different. Given our collective experiences in this country, January 6, 2021 was, in the hearts and minds of many African Americans, just another day, as one journalist called it. Time and again, we have witnessed the instances of what the historian Carol Anderson has called white rage at the perception, and I emphasize perception, of Black progress in the United States. We saw it in the redemption period following the failed reconstruction of the South following the Civil War. We saw it in the civil rights, in the rise of conservatism following the civil rights movement. We saw it in the aftermath of the election of Barack Obama as president of the United States in 2008. And we see it now again in 2012, as a nation has elected its first non-white male, a woman of Jamaican and Indian descent, to the office of vice president in what was widely understood to be the most free and fair election in American history. In many ways, the attack on the Capitol can be seen as an attack on Black America. It was an attack on the multiracial democracy. It was an act of war that we fear represents the beginning, not the end. It was an attack on the house that we Black Americans built literally. After all, not only did enslaved people build the Capitol building and much of Washington, it was enslaved Black people who provided the unpaid labor that fueled the plantation economy that enabled the United States to emerge as the global economic superpower that it has become. Yet an attack on the Capitol is also an attack on Black Americans, because to the extent that this nation is better than it was at its founding, to the extent that this is a more inclusive democracy than it was in 1776, is because Black people led the way and gave our lives in making it so. And this is what we're here to talk about today. What does this all mean? Where do we go from here? This is a conversation between several scholars of various aspects of race and American life, culture, and politics. This is a dynamic group, people whose scholarship and activism I highly respect. And as you come to know them and hear them today, if you don't respect them already and know them, you certainly will. At this point, I'd like to pass the proverbial microphone to Kia Caldwell to begin the introduction of our speakers.
Thank you, Ron, for that introduction. And I'll just briefly introduce our speakers. We've pulled some information from their bios, which are much more extensive than what I'll be able to get into. But starting with Erica Wilson, she is the Wade Edwards Distinguished Scholar and Thomas Willis Lambeth Distinguished Chair in Public Policy, as well as the Director of Clinical Programs and Associate Professor of Law at the UNC Law School. She specializes in civil litigation, civil rights, clinical legal education, critical race theory, education law, and public policy. Professor Wilson's scholarship has appeared in numerous legal and other scholarly journals, including the Harvard Law Review, Cornell Law Review, and the UCLA Law Review. In 2016, her work was selected for presentation at the Harvard, Yale, Stanford Junior Faculty Forum. In 2017, she was awarded the James D. Chadbourn Award for Excellence in Scholarship from the UNC School of Law. And most recently, in 2020, she founded the Critical Race Lawyering Clinic, a clinic that teaches law students how to bridge the gap between critical race theory and praxis. Professor Wilson is a native Californian, a diehard Lakers fan, and an avid runner. William Sturkey is a historian of modern America who specializes in the history of race in the American South, with a particular interest in the histories of working class racial minorities. At UNC Chapel Hill, where he is Associate Professor of History, Sturkey teaches courses on Southern and African American history. His public writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Black Perspectives, and the Bulletin of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Professor Sturkey is co-editor of the book To Write in the Light of Freedom, which is a collection of newspapers, essays, and poems produced by African American Freedom School students during the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964. And he is author of the book Hattiesburg, An American City in Black and White, published by Harvard University Press in March of 2019. Professor Sturkey's scholarship has earned several honors, including the Zocalo Book Prize, the UNC Diversity Award, the UNC Hettleman Prize, and an honorable mention for the Benjamin Hooks Institute National Book Award from the University of Memphis. Sharon P. Holland is the Townsend Ludington Distinguished Professor in American Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She is the author of Raising the Dead, Readings of Death and Black Subjectivity, and co-author of a collection of transatlantic Afro-Native criticism with Professor Tia Miles entitled Crossing Waters, Crossing Worlds, the African Diaspora in Indian Country. Professor Holland is also responsible for bringing a feminist classic entitled The Queen is in the Garbage by Leila Karp to the attention of the feminist press for publication in 2007. She is the author of the book The Erotic Life of Racism, a theoretical project that explores the intersection of critical race, feminist, and queer theory. She is currently finishing a decade-long project entitled Hume, H-U-M, Animal, Blackness, an investigation of the human-animal distinction and the place of discourse on Blackness within that discussion. You can see her work on food, writing, and all things equestrian on her blog. And the URL for that is the Professor Stable, all one word, .wordpress.com. Dr. Holland is the convener of the Critical Ethnic Studies Collective at UNC and also the chair of the American Studies Department at UNC Chapel Hill. Finally, last but not least, and the most recent addition to this group of esteemed scholars is Dr. Tracy Mcmillan Cotton. She is an associate professor in the School of Information and Library Science at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and also a senior research fellow at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life. Last year, she was awarded the MacArthur Fellowship, so we want to kind of congratulate her on that virtually. And Dr. Mcmillan Cotton's research spans higher ed, labor, race, class, gender, and digital societies. Her work has been noted across the US and the world for her incisive analysis and accessibility, from her award-winning essay collection, Thick, to the critically acclaimed Lower Ed book. She centers Black women as rational actors, making the best of the unequal choices they are given. And I have to add, she's been on the Trevor Noah show, I believe, a couple times, right? So that's also quite wonderful. We'd like to just thank our sponsors. The main sponsor for this event is the Department of African American, and Diaspora Studies at UNC Chapel Hill. But this event has been done in partnership with the Institute of African American Research, the Sonia Haynes Stone Center for Black Culture and History, the Critical Ethnic Studies Collective, the University Libraries, the Center for the Study of the American South, the Institute for the Arts and Humanities, and the Departments of History, American Studies, Public Policy, Communication, Sociology, and Political Science. Special thanks to the University Libraries for producing our flyer as well. So we will hear from each of our speakers for up to 12 minutes, and then we'll open it up for more of a conversation amongst them as well as with the audience. So please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A tab on Zoom, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible during the course of this event. So let's start with Erica Wilson. We'll start with Erica Wilson, then William Sturkey, Sharon Holland, and Tracy Cotton. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kia and Ron, for convening this gathering. It's a real pleasure to be here with such a great group of colleagues. So I'm going to share my screen because in order to discuss sort of my reaction to the insurrection, I want to show a few pictures that I think for me crystallize some of my feelings. So bear with me for one moment. And hopefully you can see the pictures. Can you all see that? Yeah. Okay. So as a lawyer and law professor, as I'm sitting at home watching this all unfold on television, on Twitter, the first thing that I actually thought of was an 1857 decision called the Dred Scott case, where Chief Justice Roger B. Taney held that all Black citizens, all Black people, whether free or enslaved, were not citizens and could never become citizens of the United States. And so one of the reasons I thought about that is because prior to the events of the insurrection, we were, or at least many of us were riding on a high, seeing that Georgia had flipped, that Black voters in Georgia went out and did the damn thing in terms of turning that state, something that people thought would never happen. And so the lens through which I was watching this was one in which I thought to myself, you know, Black people have given so much to America. We've given more probably than we could ever get back. And you know, just how much we've sacrificed in order for this country to exist, for this democracy to exist in whatever failed state it exists. So with that in mind, I'm watching this, what was initially a protest unfold. Not, I'm really legit can't believe what I'm seeing in terms of the lack of police presence, the way that the officers who were there were handling it, etc. So later on, after all the events transpire, we get this photo of a Black Capitol officer who has literally put his body on the line to protect members of Congress. He diverted a mob of rabid, very angry white folks who were looking to do great bodily harm to people in Congress. So I wanted to show this picture because for me it depicted the great dilemma that Black people have always faced in terms of loving a country that doesn't necessarily love us back. The extent to which we've gone to protect a space that does not protect us, the way in which this Black officer single-handedly diverted what it could have been something much, much worse. And so he literally risked his life to lead this mob away from the Senate chamber for, frankly, a body, the Senate in particular, that is legislated in ways that are hostile, if down, not antagonistic towards Black people. So the irony was not lost on me after I saw this photo. And so I want to show another photo as well. And this is the second thought that I had in reflecting on what happened.
Erica, just to let you know, we are seeing your speaker notes. So I don't know if there's a way to change your display settings. We don't see an image right now.
Oh, okay. Let's see. How about now?
It's not in slideshow mode. So you might want to go to display settings.
Okay.
Not sure.
Erica,
Well,
we'll just get through it.
Yeah, we'll get through
Yeah.
it. I'll just read
Okay.
it for you because this slide is actually, and I can actually take my stop share now so you can see me instead of photo you can't see. In any event, so the second photo that I wanted to show was a collection of headlines from the New York Times, Washington Post, etc., that summarized what had happened. And many of them said things like an attack on democracy, an attack on the rule of law. And so that second piece, an attack on the rule of law, really struck me as a lawyer, because on the day of the 6th was actually the first day of classes at the law school. So I spent a lot of time thinking about what I was going to say to my students who come to law school ostensibly because they believe in the rule of law and want to be a part of a nation of laws in which the law appropriately structures and orders society. And so the events at the Capitol made it clear that the rule of law maybe isn't what we thought it was. And so the irony for me of the post analysis suggesting that this is an attack on democracy, attack on the rule of law, is everything that preceded the actual physical attack at the Capitol. In particular, I'm talking about the attack on Black voting rights, the ways in which Black people were forced to stand in line for hours in order to vote. What was quickly lost in the news when the former president was heard on audio tape putting pressure, coercive like pressure on the Georgia Secretary of State to come up with the 11,000 votes or whatever it is he needed to turn that state around. So the reason that struck me is because we don't tend to think about the ways in which the rule of law works essentially to protect white supremacy and to the disadvantage of Black people. And so this event at the Capitol forced us to at least, or forced mainstream media in particular, to really start to call into question the rule of law. But the way they phrased it in terms of an attack on the rule of law really troubled me, because as far as I'm concerned, for Black citizens in particular, the rule of law has never been sacrosanct. It's never protected us. In fact, the law has been used in many ways to reify racial hierarchies that disadvantage us, to legitimize illegitimate forms of voter suppression, illegitimate forms of all kinds of racial subordination. So that struck me pretty deeply, to see those headlines and to see the ways in which it was cast as that particular attack was an attack on the rule of law and democracy, but not everything that preceded that, as if that what happened on the 6th occurred in a vacuum, and as if that was separate and apart from what Black citizens have been enduring for a very long time, but recently in the recent election cycle. The last reflection on the events that I want to share is the postscript in terms of this is not who we are. And so if my slides were working, the last slide I wanted to show was of the infamous picture of the white man parading through the Capitol with the Confederate flag. And the uproar about the flag never having breached the Capitol like that before. And so one of the things that bothered me about the way that was being depicted is, if you've been to the Capitol, then you know that there are something like 10 bronze marble sculptures and busts honoring leaders of the Confederacy in that building, right? And so when people say this is not who we are, that flag in the building, it was just it's not intellectually honest, because that building has indeed honored people who were traitorous secessionists, and that particular event with the flag only forced people to be outraged because it was so blatant and in your face, but as if the entire structure and history of that building should not have been called into question before in terms of the honoring of Confederate persons in that building. And so when I say that this is not who we are, for us as Black citizens, this is exactly who we are. It's exactly who we've always been. So it's my hope that we can have an honest dialogue about that and where we go from here. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wilson. We'll turn the mic, so to speak, over to Professor Sturkey. Please unmute yourself.
And I make fun of people that happens to all the time. I just want to say thanks to Ron and Kia for inviting me to appear on the panel. Thanks to my fellow panelists and to everybody in the audience for tuning in. I'm glad I'm going second because a lot of my points have been taken already. So first of all, of course, Saving the House We Built is an appropriate title historically. As my other panelists have pointed out, the Capitol building itself was built by enslaved laborers who were rented out from their masters. And of course, it was also Black people who have always pushed the United States to actually realize the stated purpose of our democracy, from Frederick Douglass to enslaved people who ran away, to Black people who voted during Reconstruction, to the Black men and women who fought during World War II, despite not being able to vote, to the Civil Rights Movement. Black people have always been at the forefront of pressing the United States to actually act as a democracy, because that's exactly what the United States claims to be. After all, it was Frederick Douglass who said, "What to the slave is the 4th of July." And it was Martin Luther King Jr. who said on the night before he died, "All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper." So yeah, it's the house we built, literally and figuratively. So when I saw what was happening on January 6th, I had two reactions. One was mostly a knee-jerk reaction to contemporary politics, and the other was more historical. So one was pretty short, the other one was a bit longer. I'm going to share the short one first. When I saw those wild actors, you know, the QAnon shaman and all of that running through the Capitol, climbing the walls, you know, heard about them defecating on the floors and spreading them around and stealing podiums and breaking into offices and assaulting the police officers. Part of me said, good. Let people see who the Republican Party really is. So the Republican Party since 1964 has operated with this veneer of, you know, Lincoln and Reagan and conservatism with ideals, right? Ideas. But to win elections, they've always had to welcome in the snakes and the bugs. They've catered to the nasty, the angry, the white supremacist underside of American political life for decades. And until about 2015, they had a lid on it, right? They were perfectly happy getting those people in line to vote for their causes, but they had a lid on it, right? But make no mistake, this goes back to 1964, when Barry Goldwater was nominated by the GOP after voting no against ending Jim Crow. He actually voted no against the Civil Rights Act. And of course, what happened was that was 1964, the first time a Republican took to the Deep South since Reconstruction. This goes back to Reagan in 1980, going to Neshoba County, Mississippi, where 3 young voting rights activists were murdered in 1964, and telling the white crowd there that he supported states' rights. That's barely even a dog whistle, right? The people that they have been appealing to, right? They appealed to people who fought against making Martin Luther King Jr. Day a national holiday. They've been welcoming the most anti-Black American citizens into their party for decades. And they've always wanted that unsavory element in their party. But now their problem is that the idiots are running the asylum. So part of me said, good. Let people see the nasty underside of the Republican Party so they can finally understand what Black people have always known about that coalition. The second is historical, right? And again, Professor Wilson said this just a second ago. This is who we are, right? We love the idea of democracy right up until Black people actually get a say in it. Then white supremacists will throw out the whole damn thing, right? Throughout American history, we see time and time again that certain elements of our society only appreciate democracy so long as it benefits them. This is written into the Constitution, okay? We get the 3/5 compromise at the dawn of our republic, the 3/5 compromise, which rigs elections in favor of white Southern slaveowners, right? The Civil War itself in 1861, the bloodiest conflict in the history of this country, was the result of an election that was rejected, okay? The Confederacy didn't sit around and say, okay, you know what? Let's wait and see what policies Abraham Lincoln might enact. Let's see what happens. Let's let the political process play out. Let's invoke civil discourse. No, they said, to hell with this. We're out of here. We're going to form our own country, right? A white ethno state, and we're going to form it so that we can enslave the entire African race and spread slavery, not just across the American West, but into Mexico and the Caribbean, even further, right? There was no, let's wait and see and let politics play out. Civil War ended, thank God. The North won. Hiram Revels, right, an African-American who was sent to the US Senate, 1871, right, sent there by Black Mississippi voters. When they were getting ready to send Hiram Revels to the Senate, Southern white supremacists had a problem based on his eligibility. If we go back to the Dred Scott case that Professor Wilson mentioned, they said that because of the Dred Scott case, Hiram Revels had only been an American citizen for just a handful of years, meaning that he was not qualified, right? He should be disqualified. His race does not qualify him to serve as a United States Senator in the 1870s. We got another African-American senator who followed Hiram Revels, right? The first two Black American senators in the history of this country came out of Mississippi. What followed was a response of Mississippi in 1875, the Mississippi Revolution of 1875, in which all the largest white supremacist newspapers in the state called for white actors to get out and fight against African Americans who wanted to go out and vote, to march cannons down streets, to shoot them off in broad daylight, which overturned Mississippi's Reconstruction era government. The following year, we get the same similar thing happen in Louisiana and South Carolina and Florida, which leads to the end of Reconstruction. And of course, Wilmington, 1898, as African Americans still enjoyed some electoral success in this state, we had a violent coup in Wilmington in 1898. The Civil Rights Movement is another example, right? The Civil Rights Movement, after a long era of Jim Crow, that lasted longer than the time between the Civil Rights Movement and now, right? But after this long era of Jim Crow, white Southerners all of a sudden left the Democratic Party, right? White Southerners loved the Democratic Party more than any block of voters in the history of this country. They at times voted as high as 97% in support of the Democratic Party in Mississippi and Franklin Roosevelt. That is right up until Black people got the right to vote. Then we get party realignment happening, right? No Democratic candidate has won a majority of the white vote since the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which gave Black people the right to vote. They said, to hell with the Democratic Party, we're done with it so long as Black people can participate in the democracy. And of course, by the time that happened, so many Black folks had been run out of the South that we didn't have majorities anymore. Decades later, we see this pattern continue, right? When Barack Obama was elected president of the United States, what did you see? People saying that he was ineligible to actually serve as the American president. He couldn't possibly be ineligible, right? Birtherism was an excuse. The real problem was that he was Black, right? Just like Hiram Revels was. And then of course we get court cases, Shelby versus Holder, right? Which then allows for expansions on voter ID and the creation of enormous obstacles to voting that we still see in this day and age. And so it actually makes perfect sense that they would reject the result of 2020, right? This enormous victory of Joe Biden, in spite of the still rigged electoral college that was designed in the first place to protect slave owners' interests, and it still rigs our national elections, it makes complete sense. And the other reason that it does still make complete sense that they would reject such a result is that we in this country still celebrate the people who fought against our own democracy, right? We celebrate the enslavers. We celebrate the Confederacy all over our commemorative landscape. We still celebrate the murderers from Wilmington whose names are dotted all across our campuses. And so of course they felt justified in storming the Capitol because they have plenty of reason to believe that America's democracy is only right so long as it is white. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for these powerful statements and provocations, and we're going to come back and follow up on what you've been saying. So let's move on to Professor Cottom, and then we'll have Professor Holland.
Thank you, Kia, and everyone for being here today, and especially to my esteemed panelists who, as it goes on, it gets both easier and harder because, you know, yes, everything that Erica and William just said, all of that times two, et cetera, right? So let's see, what do I have to add? I think, so we were presented with the, you know, like, what were your thoughts as you watched January 6th unfold? Much like Ronald started us with the quote, who I think it's Adam Seward, Jamel Bowie, many Black writers who said, oh, I thought it was January 6th. I mean, I thought it was the day after the 5th and the day before the 7th. As did many, you know, not just Black people, but I think especially Black people, but I think a lot of people of color. I've been talking to indigenous people across the country who are saying the same thing. Like, what? You're shocked that the United States of America doesn't hold to its promises? Like, I got a couple of Native nations who would like to talk to you about your shock and dismay. What happened on Capitol Hill on January 6th, I think if there's anything that I would hope would stick, am not confident will stick in the public discourse. We can already see the rewriting of history happening in real time, right, going on around us. But my primary takeaway was, the violence outside in many ways distracted from the violence that was happening inside. Right. And I want to put those on the same continuum. So yes, you had a violent insurrectionist mob that storms the Capitol building, but let's also remember what was happening inside, right? Because that was the routine, everyday, quotidian enactment of white identity politics, which will always be, has always been, and will always be a politics of dispossession, extraction, oppression, and violence. That it was bureaucratic in its nature happening within the building actually makes it more violent, not less, would be my argument. Because what was happening inside the Capitol building was a bureaucratic insurgency. To delegitimize a multiracial republic. And frankly, until it got violent outside, it was winning. I'd like to point that out. Really, the political problem for the Republican Party is that they overshot, right? The Democrats didn't take this this advantage away from them in that moment, anyway, of the certifying of the Electoral College votes. The Republicans overshot and therefore undermined what was a fairly successful coup that was happening inside of that building. I want to talk about the white racial framing that shapes political and social discourse that, that doesn't just lead us to that place, but was produced by that place and by that moment. And as William points out, all of the historical moments of which this is part and parcel, is part of a very long historical trajectory of the way that white identity politics is framed and understood. Our first problem is that we don't often think about politics for white folks through that racial language, and the racial language certainly that we give every other voter who is always accused of doing, quote unquote, doing identity politics. White American voters invented, however, identity politics, and that everyday white identity politics has become more salient. Ashley Jordan is a political scientist, and her survey data shows that a little over 40% of white voters now think of themselves through their white racial identity. Right. And what I think that we were seeing is what happens when white people feel white. Right? The development of a white racial identity was supposed to be, by the way, a project for anti-racist work. If we could just get white people to think as white people, to see and understand themselves as part of this social construction, their white identity framing. As it turns out, when white people feel white, they also feel possessive of public life, and they also feel like they are under threat. Part of that threat, as they understand it, which Erica pointed to earlier, is on this like continuum of what is often thought of as a public health crisis, which is this white deaths of despair. And it's this idea that increasingly white Americans, as they become awakened to their white racial identity, do not necessarily relate with the anti-racist part of being white. What they are relating to is a profound sense of perceived loss of social status, right? What we have seen over the last few weeks, and what I suspect we will continue to see as more white people engage with an explicit white identity framing, out of the vacuum of our assumptions about a progressive politics, racial politics in this country, I think they are more likely to find a home in the ideologies and the rhetoric that shaped the Republican Party over the last 40 years. It is a ground that has been well seeded and fertilized for a white racial identity politics to take root, not in anti-racism, but in pro-white identitarianism. And white identitarianism can only ever be violent. Now, they're going to do it two ways. That violence is either going to be done with the assemblage of the racial repertoire that we saw unfold on Capitol Hill on January 6th. Erica points out the waving of the Confederate flag, how often white identitarianism draws on the racial repertoires of the US South, in particular the white Confederate South. Those ideas have always been historically contingent, always picked up in times of perceived conflict. This conflict, however, I think is thought to be so purely racial and racialized that this is really the only way it could go. I think that the white identitarian is increasingly the likely white American voter, certainly the likely white Republican voter, and that the white identitarian, the one who votes and the one that shows up on Capitol Hill waving the Confederate flag, are equally a threat to democratic institutions and publics. I think that the white identitarian voter is at least as dangerous as their extremist kin. I think that what we know about white racial identity repertoires is that they will graft historical iconography onto current media spectacles. That's the adoption of not just Klan ideology, but how much the Proud Boys are a remix of the performance of the Ku Klux Klan, the adoption of Nazi symbols, and especially the adoption of the Confederate symbols, which I pointed out, but also the symbols of white purity. So we laugh at somebody like the shaman, who is a ridiculous figure, right? But what he's calling out to in his performance there of the Nordic figure is a fictive imagined history for whiteness in this country that has a very long history. Because white people are created by anti-Blackness and capitalism, don't actually have a place and don't originate from a place. They have created a fictive ideology. And a lot of those ideologies run through ideas about Greek and Nordic cultures as being the original pure whiteness, that we see all of these old ideas about who and what white people are reemerge on a modern stage, I think should have us questioning how those repertoires have been embedded in the ideas and the circulation of ideas. It is part and parcel of why the internet exists. So the internet and modern technology certainly play a part, but they are not actually, I think, at the root of the problem, which is where we often locate it. I would shift the root of the problem to where it has always been, which is, again, the idea of whiteness. I think it's important for us to keep in mind about how much emotions shaped the experience of becoming white or explicitly white. We've focused a lot on how much whiteness oppresses other people. I think too often assuming that if people just know how oppressive whiteness is, they will choose something else. And one of my takeaways from January 6th is something that's someone like sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva is always reminding us of, which is that racism feels good, right? There's a positive emotional experience of being racist, of being oppressive, of being violent, of subjugating others. And it is just as likely that people will tap into the visceral emotional experience of being racist as it is that they will tap into the maybe less emotionally resonant experience of being anti-racist. I don't think that solving that problem is a problem for non-white people. I think, as has always been the case, we live in the shadow of white people's family dramas, but don't have the authority and autonomy to negotiate them. What we do well, as William pointed out historically, is that we make the words mean what they're supposed to mean. And so one of my takeaways is that white people will absolutely destroy the idea of democracy before they will allow it to operate in practice, unless there's more of us than there are of them. And probably the way forward isn't through priming an uncritical white identity lens, because as it turns out, when you do that, I think you get what we had on January 6th.
Thank you so much for giving us additional food for thought, additional things to read. And I'm going to pass the Zoom mic over to our final speaker, before we open up for questions and discussion. Professor Holland.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here with my colleagues, and I am going to screen share just a really quick image and then let you look at that, and then I'm going to get to the little pieces of reflection that I wrote up about the events. Let me see if I could actually screen share the appropriate image. All right, got a little piece here. It's called White Supremacy's Handshake. There's a quote from James Baldwin: "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." I like to start with story because in many ways it is where we all live, in the stories we tell each other about who we are and where we come from. Story is how we make sense of the things that happen to us on the daily. They are always already fodder for theorizing. This story this one is no different, and it is, I assure you, a very ordinary story. During these twin pandemics of dis-ease and anti-Black feeling, I found myself with a broken stove. The hearth of my home had diminished already in the pandemic, to be sure. No more large gatherings of queer family around the hum of the range working its magic. In my quest to replace this small corner of my world, I was lucky enough to have some advocates in the everyday and stressful ritual of receiving services in pandemic times. During this endeavor, I opened an email from someone who was helping me. They had the heroic fervor of those who think they found a way forward in what looks like a hot mess. I redact the first part of that email here, and I quote, "Sharon, do you remember the famous scene in Gone with the Wind when Scarlett, resplendent in her green gown, shoots her fist in the air and exclaims, quote, 'As God is my witness, ... I do not own a plantation nor a green gown, but as God is my witness, we are going to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat for you, ... It went on. If we were live in the same room, I might hear a gasp or two. In my mind, actually, I can hear my favorite and beloved uncle working this tale like a squirrel on an acorn hull. He would send this tale up as high comedy and spin it in every direction. We have learned to turn pain into an art form. This story would stay with my family for years to come until it becomes someone else's story to tell or remember, or is bested by yet another. This small tale does a lot of work that points to this moment for Blackness in our nation's history. This moment is not the story of reconciliation and redemption, and neither were the events on our nation's capital, my hometown, the place I shared my girlhood with when I wasn't in the pine groves of North Carolina, a place that we used to call Chocolate City. The person who wrote this email hailed me. They wanted me to come out and play a part in a story so ubiquitous in this nation that the pro-offered invitation is assured the ritual of a healthy and enthusiastic acquiescence. I will tell you this. I saw that first line and immediately closed my computer and took my dogs for a long walk. Wherever this person was going with that opening salvo, it wasn't going to be good. And I cursed again the nice Irish name I had inherited from two sides of my family tree. I wanted to ask them, what does it mean to say you don't own a plantation? What is a plantation to you? What I am trying to offer here in this story and its attendant literary analysis, forgive me, always the English professor, is that we still have yet to ferret out where a kind of common white supremacy lives and breathes and how it thrives so very quietly, ? At times among us. Be assured that a story is being told here, but it is one in which I get to play a slave, quote unquote, to use a familiar note of Black pessimism's theoretical apparatus. The story that hails me has several functions: to draw together everyday Southern loving people into collective story, to convey shared intimacy of both purpose and culture, and perhaps most importantly, to continue the subtle handshake between Southern persons, in particular, like that casual handshake between a police officer on UNC's campus and an armed heir to the Confederacy protester. A handshake, a gentleman's agreement between like-minded individuals. But what does this handshake require from Blackness? That we endure in the everyday, that we join the pernicious social contract that sees grievous error and bodily harm as harmless gaffe. And I want to remind you here of the way in which the Rodney King video was parsed in the 90s until it didn't depict at all what we saw. 400 years of looking away has conditioned us to accept the green dress and Gone with the Wind and not the plantation and the window on which those curtains hang. It is time for us to call the plantation not what it should be to us today, but what it has always been: theft of indigenous land, the making of human being into machine, the space from which our democracy was thwarted and born all at once, an awful simultaneity. I've been called upon to account for so much of what happens in this deeply historic place, this South, where over 5 generations of Black cisgendered women in my immediate line have called home. In this multi-generational relationship, there's what I would call a psychic life, a thread of connection that is no material or even sometimes affective life. I never met my maternal great-grandmother, for example, yet I feel her to be part of me. This connectivity is the stuff of Black cultural life, and it creates, to use historian Taya Miles's language, a tie that binds through generations of separation and violence, and yes, loss and despair. This is a system of ethical action, calling things as they are, and deliberate appreciation that stands in direct contradiction to white supremacy, where passing off one thing for another is easy, and the South emerges as a competent grifter, the confidence man at the center of our democratic rituals and ideals. In many ways, white supremacy is American culture and its form of governance, if you look at the historical conditions under which America came to be, and take these conditions for what they are, rather than claim to be. We must once and for all trade in the madness, and this is in closing, of a practice looking away, of a trained not seeing of the body of the enslaved being enduring a public beating while we go about our everyday. This scene is not a break in life, but its condition. We have sustained sedition among us and called it heritage. We have made the goals of democracy subservient to a sugar-coated ideal that is fast losing its currency. A confederacy, after all, is what Webster's intended it to be: an alliance of people or groups formed for an illicit purpose. What do I want? I want you to join us in telling a much more vibrant, truthful, and meaningful story of who we are and how we came to be. That is a hand I might like to grasp in friendship and indifference. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists so far for those opening remarks. Definitely thought-provoking and intellectually stimulating for me as a colleague, and I'm sure for our audience as well. And we're going to flow from here, offering a few questions that I have, that Kia has, but also to engage questions from our audience. And one of the things I'm thinking about, I wanted to invite the panelists to offer some more on is the significance of myth and the myth of American greatness and exceptionalism, the myth of white supremacy, and the way that myth thrives in our society, because in many ways our republic is organized around a myth. And that myth has been the basis for, all men are created equal. And really how at the founding of the republic, this notion of all men are created equal, they weren't talking about all people, they were talking about men. This is a republic that was organized with that, and a government that was, society that was organized and erected that excluded 90% of the population because of their poverty, half of the population because of their sex, and 25 to 30% of the population because of their race. And so this idea of, what they promised, there seems to be a tension that exists in the country still between what they promised in terms of what one group interprets it to be and what other groups interpret it to be. And there's no more compelling example of that than the fact that 74 million people, whatever that number was, voted for Donald Trump. So what do we make of that in this moment? What does it say about us as a nation? How does that tie in with the attack on the Capitol? And any thoughts you have about, those ideas?
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy to start if that's okay. Look, I think there's a lot of myths in American history. One of the most crucial is that white people build all this, right? Therefore, it belongs naturally to them. So there have been so many contributions from all sorts of people, be them Native Americans, Mexican Americans, Tejanos, African Americans, women, etc., that have simply been erased from our national historical narrative, right? And because of that, many people operate with this sense that this was all built by white people. Now, slavery was sort of an afterthought, but then, of course, part of that myth was that slavery wasn't all that bad. In fact, parts of slavery was even necessary for some folks to adopt to civilization coming from Africa. But all these sorts of myths really give great ownership, I think, to the history of white Americans, because their people are central to our founding story and everybody else has been pushed aside.
I mean, one thing I would add to that, I think it's an important point when you think about myth, is that whiteness is a myth. I think that it's important to start there because it's the center of everything. Whiteness, I teach my students that whiteness is a legal artificial construct, right? People used to go to court to litigate, to get a court order saying that they were white, so that they could not be enslaved, or so that they could become citizens, they could own property, whatever the case might be. So when you have the very categorization of people, that being whiteness in particular, deriving from a myth, everything that follows makes sense. I mean, it makes sense that you've got to sustain the myth by centering this artificial construct of whiteness and telling stories that validate the creation of that category. I like to tell my son sometimes people tell a lie so long they believe it, or they say what they want the truth to be so long that they actually believe it's true. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing with whiteness generally, and all of the stories that flow from that.
If I could just point out one other thing, this is UNC specific. There's so many different layers to this. Our institutions and our states, our history books all across this country do this. But look, we all work at UNC Chapel Hill. When they talk about Black people at UNC Chapel Hill history, they come up in 1950, right? When we desegregated the campus. Black people were all over this campus way before 1950. The Board of Trustees talked about them all the time. Their existence is never recognized. We have a mural in the post office down the street over here that celebrates these white men all laying the foundation of Old East building here, first building ever constructed. These are all white slave owners. We know them by name, and there's not a single enslaved person to be seen, right? So even in our institutions, the stories that we tell ourselves are also that this was all created, solely by these single great white men. And I think therefore the message is it belongs to them.
Okay. Tracy, were you taking a stab at that?
No, I wanted to just reiterate really Erica's point, because it would have been mine. And to tie it back, I think, to your question, Ron, about, American exceptionalism is not a myth. America is quite exceptional. It's just only really been exceptional at the myth making of whiteness. And everything else flows with that. So whenever anybody presents me with, I talk a lot about the myths of mobility, and there's always an inherent dialectical tension in them. The exceptionalism one is no different. And the dialectic tension is absolutely exceptional, but exceptional doesn't mean good.
Exceptionally problematic.
It just means it's of note. It's noteworthy in its scale and grandeur. It does not mean that it's good.
Well, thank you all for that. Sharon, did you want to comment on that or no? No pressure. We could have more questions too. So,
I think my colleagues had that well in hand. The data on everything, yeah.
okay, I want to turn to a question from the audience, and then I'm going to pass it to Kia for a question that she may have. From an anonymous attendee. Oh, wait. Okay. An anonymous attendee says, in a world in which Black Lives Matter graces the homepage of Amazon and white people are able to deflect their complicity by claiming to be an anti-racist, how does the movement resist whiteness' insistence on forgiving itself or its ability to redeem itself? So that's a question from an anonymous attendee. And thinking about these signs, right? And everybody has a Black Lives Matter sign. In this house, we believe that love is love and science is real. It's a slogan now. It's on Amazon, it's on Google. Google puts up its Martin King image. It did it 2 weeks ago. What do we do, with that? What do we make of white people, deflecting their complicity by claiming to be anti-racist? And sort of white forgiveness and, I have thoughts about it, but you all are the panelists. What do we do here?
I can start on that one, I think. People, I think we need to understand that anti-racist work is a practice. It's not something you develop by putting a sign on your lawn. It's something you develop by confronting racist practice around you. And growing that skin, growing that muscle to be able to really respond. And this idea that we can have our anti-racism slogan without our anti-racist work makes no sense, right? So that's what I'm thinking in terms, and I'm also thinking of Charles Mills's work and the racial contract, right? That the thing that really has to be understood is that the very system that produces whiteness also produces its invisibility. It is a simultaneity, right? That's why there needs to be work, because it's the invisibility that needs to be unpacked. One can't just say, Black Lives Matter and, keep moving. It's like, well, how are you going to make that real in your life, right? That's a practice. And that takes time and effort and perhaps some redistribution of wealth.
As the kids say, Sharon, that part.
I mean, one thing I would add to that is that we also have to really dig in hard and resist the commodification of the Black Lives Matter movement. I think in some ways it's become a commodity for businesses, for individuals to put up the Black Lives Matter sign or put it on their company website. And as the comment suggested, it absolves them of any culpability or guilt, and it makes it okay to socially or from a business perspective associate with them. So we have to, in terms of a movement, as Sharon said, I think we have to continue to push and demand more substantive justice, substantive redistributions, and not be satisfied with rhetorical devices that are used really for absolving purposes.
And then to the point of myth, you had in moments of riots, if it's Watts, if it's Rodney King, you had non-Black businesses who put up Black-owned signs, hoping that people wouldn't damage their property. So you can put up a Black Lives Matter sign and really not believe that Black Lives Matter.
The signifier becomes the point, right? Like, yeah. I just want to say, I recently wrote about my concerns that in anti-racist work, we may have buried the lead a little too well. And I use we very loosely because that's not my fault. But that the collective we may have buried the lead. The point of anti-racism work is to break up with whiteness. That is the end goal. Yes, to be a good person and to help non-white people, be in solidarity with non-white people. But the goal was never to put up a sign, and the goal was never to experience all the good, warm, fuzzy feelings, especially I love this in Sharon's essay, the email, right? Wanting to engage in the good emotional theater and performance of reaching out. Right? No, the ultimate end of anti-racism work is to stop being white. It is not to become okay with white, not to give us a better version of whiteness, because whiteness, as Erica points out, is an idea that is built itself on a fiction. And the fiction only holds with a myth that can constantly oppress and expropriate people. So the only real end goal of anti-racism work is not your sign, and they're lovely. And I'm really just a little jealous because my neighborhood wouldn't even let us put those up. So you couldn't even have a sign, which I was like, well, maybe that forced people back inside to think more about their anti-racism work. I tried to think of the upside of that one. But yeah, the point was never the sign, and it is to end and to break up with whiteness. And I think we may have lost some of that in the, and some of it I want to give credit to, right? Some of it is performance, but some of it is very hard work. But the work itself was never what it was supposed to do for us. It is what it is supposed to do with you and your relationship to being white.
Maybe for Valentine's Day this year, we ought to have a campaign, break up with whiteness.
I'm actually very much on board with that. I like that idea. I'll write the Hallmark card.
I love this. I love this idea of breaking up with whiteness, and it's certainly not something we're hearing on the Today Show and in mainstream media. It's sort of whiteness 2.0, like you can be a better white person, like you were saying, Tracy. And I'm wondering if we can bring this home, so to speak, although we're not probably physically on campus, but what does this conversation about white supremacy mean for all universities, but particularly Southern universities like UNC Chapel Hill, built by enslaved people that still have deeply rooted white supremacy? And it's been normalized, it's been naturalized. Some of us talk about how, just issuing the statements is not enough, right? So in light of, and in the aftermath of January 6th, how do we think about these institutions? And when January 6th happened, yeah, it was another day, but it was also like, we've had so many January 6th at UNC Chapel Hill. We've had so many white supremacists come to the campus armed, right? We've had so many moments of terror and, police being on campus to deal with protests, and it goes on. And Sharon showed the image of the campus police officer shaking the hands of a white supremacist. So how should we be thinking about institutions? Should we be thinking about them any differently in light of January 6th than we were before? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm going to say something that might be a little bit controversial, but I'll say it. I mean, one of the things about institutions like UNC is not only do we have to think about how white supremacy manifests itself within the university, but we also have to think about the product that these universities are putting out. I would be remiss if I didn't point out that one of the Trump lawyers who was pressing the crazy claims that were Rule 11 sanctionable, in my opinion, was a graduate of the law school. I mean, this is a real thing. I mean, in a lot of ways, some of the folks who do a lot of the bidding, the hardcore bidding of white supremacy, not just the wearing the sheets or the signs, but the enacting the laws, the arguing against the validity of an election, are products of major institutions, whether it's Harvard, Yale, UNC, whatever the case might be. They are, these places are serving as training grounds for producing graduates who are going out to do that kind of work. So I think that is a really important point that we shouldn't skimp over, the function that universities play in producing the people who are making turning white supremacy into real live lived oppressive experiences for folks.
I just want to reiterate that, we have this myth in our commemorative landscape, and like the African American Studies Department, for example, is housed in a building named for a slaveholder. Like our chancellor sends out a Juneteenth announcement, and his building is sitting on a street named after the largest slave owner in the history of the state of North Carolina. And we really have some real contradictions that we're just simply not willing to deal with. And I think, quite frankly, one of the mistakes that I've made and I've seen made over the last few years is we are not thinking about going about this the right way, because we are relying so much on moral suasion from our university leaders. We are not in a state of educational policy and leadership in this country anymore where people really influence public policy in significant ways. I was reading this book earlier about the New Deal era in North Carolina, and Howard Odom and Frank Porter Graham, right? People who went on to become governors and run for Senate and have a major impact on social policy and politics in their states. We don't have university leaders like that anymore. The structure of universities are different in that regard. We have people who manage day-to-day functions of universities. We no longer have visionaries who want to help use the leverage of the institution to make our society a better place. And so by going to those people, I think we're barking up the wrong tree. But it's also that very same change, I think, that has created a space for people like us to have a bigger influence on our society. And so I think we need to think creatively about how we organize to leverage the influence of the institution without having to go up the administrative ladder.
Thank you. There is a follow-up on Erica's comment in the chat. Deborah Gerhardt said, I'd love to hear what you think the obligation is of law schools to call out grads from many years ago. Is staying silent complicity? Thank you.
I mean, I think it's a good question. I mean, I think that it's important that any institution, I think, set the record straight in terms of what's right, particularly lawyers when it comes to the rule of law and what it is that we're trained to supposed to be doing. And when we see people who are abusing the system, I do think it's important to speak out and say something. I've seen that some other universities have come out against some of the activities that have taken place with their graduates. And so I think it is a critical thing that a university or law school should do. But that's my personal opinion.
I want to turn to a couple other questions from the audience. Diane Robertson asked a question. It's directed to Professor Wilson. UNC not long ago disbanded the civil rights program to train law students to litigate justice for marginalized communities in North Carolina. She said, I would just leave that there. How do you explain so actually that was just a comment, and then her question is, how do you explain or discuss the Republican Congress's refusal to accept the facts of January 6th as they apply to the previous occupant?
So I want to point out in response to the comment that we're coming back. I have a new civil rights clinic. So if you're in the law school, go ahead and sign up for it. So we're not going to take this laying down. We're coming back. But in terms of the response to the question, the thing that's troubled me the most is the way that Republicans have continued to persevere in the face of several lawsuits being struck down. The way that we're using the filing of the lawsuits to strike a veneer of legitimacy to what was really a political objection to who actually won the election. There is no rational explanation for why the Republicans are refusing to accept the conclusions of the election. Also, no rational explanation for why they are refusing to be honest about what happened on January 6th and who's responsible for it. Those are all political issues couched in race, generally couched in whiteness specifically. And so I think that it's important that anytime you're asked or we talk about what it is that the Republicans are doing and why they will or won't do this, that we point out that it's not legitimate. There are no sound basis in law for what they are doing. It's solely a political question aimed at protecting whiteness and white supremacy.
Thank you. And another question from the audience directed to you, William, says, can Dr. Sturkey explain why the Electoral College is rigged against Black people, or rigged to facilitate the continued oppression of Black people?
Yeah, I'm going to do my best shot, but this should definitely go to Professor Wilson, the attorney on the panel. So look, as the nation was our democracy was crafted, they made this bargain with the slaveholders, essentially, that they got to count 3/5 of their enslaved people as being, voting citizens, as, for congressional representation purposes of their state, right? So you got to vote. Your vote had a lot more power because you got to count 3/5 of the person that you held or that was held in your state as a citizen, even though those people were not actually represented. They didn't have a chance to vote, right? And so they had outsized power. They got to count people that couldn't vote. And so that's part of how our system was constructed. And we still see that today with the Senate, for example, right? If you're voting in Wyoming, your electoral college vote matters a lot more than if you're voting in California. So these structures, even though our society has changed by abolishing slavery, et cetera, and giving Black people the right to vote, that we still see these structures still linger to give outsized power to white voters in places like the Dakotas over African American voters in places like Chicago or New York or California.
Erica, did you want to add to that?
No, I think that's right on. It's exactly right on. I won't add anything else. You're right on it, William.
Thank you. And then I want to turn to a question that for the group about the police. What we saw in the events of January 6th, the failed coup d'etat, was a very troubling statement about the relationship of the police to the citizenry, and the relationship of the police to white supremacy, and the relationship of the police to government. We saw the strongest evidence possible of why the Congress should grant statehood to the District of Columbia. First, it's undemocratic that this majority Black city has no representation in Congress. But you also got to see how the leadership of this city was limited in its ability to protect its citizenry and the land within its jurisdiction. But we also got to see, and this goes back to Sharon's image of the handshake, the ways in which the police were complicit in what happened there. And so when we talk about defund the police, when we talk about the need to rethink policing and its need as a whole, what does this event teach us? How does this strengthen arguments about and criticisms of the police in our contemporary moment?
Well, I'll start, since I had the photograph obviously taken from, it was from NC Policy Watch. And if many of those on the panel know about NC Policy Watch, but if you don't in the audience, check them out. They really have, they have great posts about what's going on around the state. And they also see moments like this as policy making. And I think that's really important. That handshake that happened, that work that of the police is not only, I think the way that the media is representing what's happened with the police, they're representing what's going on now as if this is a new thing, right? Before, the police were something else other than what they are today, right? And I think the importance there, the important thing to do there is to historicize that handshake. That the purpose of the police is to circumvent enfranchisement and to police notions of belonging and citizenship. So if you fall outside those categories, yours is the body that the police have been created for.
Listen, I've been my activist friends and organizer friends, maybe even more specifically, have had to cakewalk me on what abolition, police abolition looks like. Listen, I was sold on the premise. I didn't understand, how we would achieve it. And I keep coming back to the image. I think maybe Erica had sort of like the flip side of Sharon's image in her slide deck of the Capitol Police officer, who on the one end was leading some of the white violent mob away from Senate offices. And then he's later, I think has been promoted, both, I think under the new administration has been promoted. He was on the dais at the swearing in of President Biden. And for how many people this was a sign of a new day has come, falling back into that progressive narrative. If we want to talk about myths, one of them is this sort of always forward marching progressive view of American, of the soul and sort of of America, and that was, evidence of that. And to me, I was thinking it's actually the exact same problem. I fundamentally believe at this point in my intellectual life that there is no reformation of the police or the police state. There is no individual you can promote. There is no, for me, there is no officer friendly. And there shouldn't be one for your children either. I think it is fundamentally incompatible with any other kind of nation but a white nationalist one. It's the only, sometimes when I'm teaching and and the students, have these competing ideas and we can't figure out how both of them are true. And I'll say, well, what needs to be true for both of these things to be true? The only way our current structure of police works is in a nation where whiteness is property and blackness is always theft. Since we cannot change then my black life or black body, there is no reconciliation for me of the police. And I'm always very, these days I'm sort of both fascinated with the progressive wing of the Democratic Party too, who is always so happy to put forward that narrative of the good apples, right? And what work that does, and how important that sort of myth making has been. But yeah, there's this moment for me about what the police did or didn't do, how they didn't show up is absolutely in keeping. Again, what would need to be true for both of those things to be accurate? That the police are both, armed to the teeth like a military force, are an occupying force in a Black city that does not have Democratic representation and also can't manage to get across town to protect the Capitol building when armed white insurrectionists show up. Well, let's see, what would have to be true? What would have to be true is that the police were doing exactly what the police are supposed to do, right? There was no threat at the Capitol building. The threat is always out in DC. There was no threat. So then that means to us, if we disagree with that premise, then you have to disagree with the police as an entity.
These are heavy topics, right? I was thinking about, in light of what you just said, Tracy, how, there are these reports and there's talk about, the police have been infiltrated by white supremacists and the military has been infiltrated by white supremacists. But if we take the police as always already a white supremacist institution, then there's no infiltration.
Exactly. I'm so confused about what that infiltration means. The only infiltration is ever just the non-white people who are the, the people who are the exceptions to the rule. You can't infiltrate the thing that is that was created for you. Yeah.
Right. So the premise there is that this is a fundamentally good institution, right? and that's kind of the bad apples logic, I think, again. I wanted to also see if we could think intersectionally about these issues of white supremacy, what happened on January 6th. You know, I attended a webinar, and I'll put the link in the chat for the attendees, Bisexuality Policy Watch today on anti-gender politics in Latin America. But it was also talking about connections to the US. It was talking about January 6th, about how there's essentially this coalition of anti-abortion rights activists, white supremacists, which is not to say those two things are incompatible, but there's kind of an interesting coalition or coalescence of different forces in this country, but also in Latin America, Catholics and evangelicals working together in certain kinds of ways. And if we think about toxic masculinity also, right, being, I think, at the heart, and not only just toxic masculinity, but toxic white masculinity. I don't know if that's how I phrased it, but, you know, we do hear about toxic masculinity, but what about toxic white masculinity? And having seen so much of that in Donald Trump, right, the epitome of that in so many ways. How are you all thinking perhaps about gender, sexuality, not just race in relationship to what happened and what has been happening in the country, but these other systems of power, domination, oppression, settler colonialism as well, I think. So I just wanted to put that out there.
One of the interesting things that I've thought a lot about is that a lot of the people out there were white women. And so I think there's this misunderstanding that that the gender would give them more empathy or interest in fighting against the very toxic white masculinity that you alluded to, Kia. But the reality is that they benefited from it, and by show of the number of white women who were not only out there. I mean, one of the victims who died was a white woman, right? They were. I think it really speaks to the extent to which whiteness is the dominant identity, whether you're talking about a white woman, a white evangelical, a white anti-abortion, whatever the case might be. The common denominator is whiteness. And as Tracy said, unless we break up with whiteness, everything else is, there's really no other possible productive solution.
I have an idea about this I'd like to share. I don't know exactly, I haven't actually ever really shared this too much in public, but you know, like the anti-abortion, white supremacy, the religion, the NRA, all of those heated issues, that's this coalition that is the Republican Party, those very, very visible, you know, we get commercials in mainstream media during presidential elections about those. To me, like, I have to wonder, like, who do those actually benefit? Because the NRA stuff is, it seems almost like it's just total gaslighting. You know, Hillary Clinton actually isn't going to take away your guns. And, you know, corporations and the wealthy benefit from this coalition, right? When they can convince people to worry about guns, when they can convince people to worry about abortion, when they can convince people to worry about standing for the anthem, or, you know, the people that put "In God We Trust" in the Pledge of Allegiance and on our money were corporations that wanted to fight against the New Deal, you know? And so what might happen if you can't divide people in these ways is that working class people might actually come together across their racial differences, as odd as that might sound, and we might have socialism in this country, or we might have policies that balance more in favor of working classes than they do the wealthy. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, you know, who stands to gain from all of this? All these white working class people that showed up for Donald Trump, that stumped for him, that stood in the cold and got left behind at the Omaha rally or whatever. What did they actually gain? It's, yeah, this feeling that racism does feel good, sure, but the real victors are the people that got the tax cut in that first year in office, right? Those are the people who have the most to gain. And to me, so much of these other things are just, you know, they're very, very convenient, divisive measures that can separate people who otherwise might have similar economic interests. And this is exactly what we saw in the wake of Reconstruction with the Confederate monuments and all of that, you know, going up, divide the races.
Thank you. So there is a question. Sharon, did you want to say something? I'm sorry.
No, I just want to, continue to really focus also on just the financial aspect, which has to do with defunding the police, right? Deplatforming them, in their relationship with our communities, but also in redistribution of wealth. It's something that a lot of mutual aid work around this country and this nation. A lot of it started before COVID, but a lot of it started during COVID, is really being successful in many ways in demonstrating that there's a lot of wealth out there that can be redistributed and very easily, and people are willing to do it. That is the striking thing about it. It isn't, I'm not saying it's not difficult to fundraise. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that there is a hunger out there for how to deal with a problem, through self-determination, letting a people self-determine, as opposed to saying, we've created this program that you must go through, right? In order to become like us. And I think part of that redistribution of wealth and self-determination are kind of going hand in hand right now. So I do feel like as white supremacy is having, one of its days, weeks, months, years, right? Once again, there are other people are pointing to the real substantial problem of lack of resources and doing something about that in communities pretty handily. And that is inspiring to me, though we need to be doing more of it.
If I could add just one quick thing about this issue over defunding the police, I get, that scares the crap out of a lot of people, as somebody said in the chat. But, one of the things that I think activists really need to do to help make that argument is to show the numbers. This is not necessarily, for many people, for some people it is, but it's not always necessarily about abolishing police, right? The police have gotten hundreds of millions of dollars of military grade equipment in our country. And there are a large number of people, I think, that if you showed them some of the data, like we have a 600,000 plus, tank that the Chapel Hill police has that they don't need. It's a waste of taxpayer dollars. And to make the argument in that vein, I think could be a way to be a bit more persuasive, at least for certain portions of the population.
Thank you. We do have a question here from Deborah Stroman. She says, thanks so much for this wonderful webinar. Please share your take or views on Vice President Harris, a quiet VP, ? Prosecutor background effect, ? Woman of color repping Black women for all that we did for the Democratic Party, et cetera, chance to be the next president. So if you have any thoughts on Harris in light of, I guess, what we've been talking about, please share those.
I'm just going to offer something small and short to get us started. As so many white leaders sit and think about, well, how do we do D&I? And we all get the emails and we all get the statements and all that. Hire Black people. And I mean, to me, her in the White House, I don't know exactly what the effect is going to be in light of, her own personal background and expertise. But we need desperately more representation in all walks of life. And so to me, my first answer is always hire Black people. And I'm very glad that she's there. I don't, again, know exactly how that will manifest itself in terms of policy, but to me, that's at least one reason for optimism.
So I'm going to add a corollary to that, because I think representation can be good too, but representation is not liberation. It's really important that we keep reiterating that representation is not liberation. It's not. And so it's going to be really important that we not allow the Biden administration to weaponize Vice President Harris as a way to quell requests, demands by Black people, other people of color, to make effective policy changes that really help our communities. I think I'm glad that she's there, that her being there is definitely better than not, I suppose. But I just, my main concern is that we don't get caught in the trap of being happy that we have a Black woman vice president. And we've already seen the script with the Obama presidency. We were probably more tepid than we should have been in terms of advocating for substantive policies. And so, and I especially worry about it because the prior administration was so bad. What we have to guard against is the possibility of people saying, well, at least it's not Trump and Pence. And that's not enough. It's no longer enough. Representation is not liberation. Good for Vice President Harris. I hope she reps us all well. But that's just the start. That's not the finish.
And I just want to support Erica in that statement because I think as the person who's been on panels before where I'm the only person saying something similar, it can be lonely out there. And so I just want to tell her I'm holding the limb with her on that one. Yeah, I just, I think, we've had a long modern romance with the Obama administration. And some of us have understood what that did perhaps to our perspective. And I think it is not only okay, but laudable for us to now be reticent about a wholehearted, full-throated endorsement that a person hasn't yet completely earned, while simultaneously saying, yes, yeah, I'm with William, hire Black people. And then I also, when Black people speak, I want to know who they mean when they say we, us, and they. And until I'm sure about who's included in those kinds of statements and where they stand on those things, I'm just a whole lot more reticent than I probably would have been 10 years ago. And I just think that the problems are just far, far too big and too deep. And a moment of possibility is too possible and close for us to play too many games.
I want to return to, the talk about Vice President Harris, and it's great to see her there and to see Blackness and Black womanhood in particular represented at that level of government. In this, but again, the importance, I think what you're all saying is it's more than about having Black faces in high places, because we've had that for a long time, and that's not a solution for change. But I'm segueing into what Sharon said, where she's touching on this, but I don't think we've dealt with it explicitly. And it also dovetails with a question by Jenny Womack. We're talking about wealth redistribution. We're talking about the nature and the problematic nature of the capitalist economy. And what do we do about that, right? Because it seems like this is the issue that people aren't willing to take on, or policymakers aren't really willing to take on, the connection between anti-racism and anti-capitalism. And that the Democratic Party seems to believe in an inclusive democracy. But in many ways, you cannot have an inclusive democracy if you do not have an inclusive market. And we have to deal with the structural issues that keep certain people out of the market and that relegate Black people, despite the fact that we've had a Black president, now a Black vice president, Black people in the Supreme Court and the like. Black people are still an underclass. And so Jenny Womack's question is, what will be the most effective mechanisms for the redistribution of wealth? And can they be enacted in the context of capitalism? Take a stab at it, Tracy.
I know, I see Erica's face too, and I feel like we might be trying to pull the same ideas from the same sky. I think because the question, once you say, is it possible within capitalism, you've so delimited almost all radical potentiality in futures and imagined futures that's where I got, I freeze. So, I'm a pragmatic person. I think I work and like to think I work in the intellectual and spiritual tradition of particularly Black women who have to be pragmatic. And so my pragmatic politics is always, You take what you can, what's on the table, and do the best you can with it while you can, while always keeping your eye on the fact that this should not be all that there is. So I say that to say, like, I have my short-term things that I think, yes, have to happen. I think if we do not, I actually don't think we talk quite enough about climate change and climate disaster and its relationship to race and racism, particularly how deeply entwined it is in racial capitalism. And if we don't shift our understanding of eco-radicalism, we're quickly going to be running out of time. And some of these like purely political conversations are all going to be moot, because our problems with things like clean water and clean air, when we see what happens in Flint, when we see what happens in Eastern North Carolina, where my people are from and have been fighting it for many, many years, when I can't go home without smelling hogs, and when I'm 50 miles out from home, from the coast, when I should be smelling the ocean, right? Like these are questions that have been wrought by capitalism, and that's what capitalism does. And so if that is at the heart of what capitalist extraction is, it has to extract and it has to turn things into a commodity. I can play the short-term game about how do I improve the lives of people right now? How do we reallocate resources? Listen, there are things that actually this administration could do that can actually be done through, as much as I hate to admit it, that can be done through the tax code. We actually can do some of those things. We can rewrite things like that, like the tax code. We can change how people pay for education. We could make those kinds of things. We would still be left, however, with the big wicked problem of there's only so much radical potential possible within capitalism, which is why, I subscribe to some other things. So yeah, that's why, the minute you say it, I go, well, yeah, until we get at full economic reparations, which to me should be the end game of capitalism, and then we start imagining the future post-capitalism. I think that's probably a fool's errand, trying to solve the problem without changing the very, very big variable of capitalism.
Erica, you want to take a stab? Oh, Sharon, go ahead.
It's okay.
Oh, Sharon, go ahead.
Are you sure? Okay. Tracy went to climate change, which is what I was thinking about even earlier, right? And I think there's your words make me think about two things. And that is the way in which the story of our relationship as Black people to revolutionary struggle is circumscribed for us, right? That the way the story about what's even happening at the Capitol is being circumscribed in the media, what you can and cannot say, how Blackness matters politically in these moments is being understood for us by other people. And a perfect example is that we can't really understand our relationship to Black revolutionary struggle and thought until we understand what our place is in it. And so when I think about animal studies work, or when I think about climate change, I think about people like the folks of the MOVE organization, who a decade before Ingrid Newkirk founded PETA were protesting in zoos and talking about the environment and thinking about raw food diet and talking to Dick Gregory, right? We have a very vibrant, and that's just one group of revolutionaries, right? We have a very vibrant legacy of attention to the fact that climate change is social justice work. And I see already the administration cordoning those two things off. There's an act about climate change and there's one about racial equity, as if the two don't have anything to say to one another. And I think that's where we come in as scholars and thinkers, is to connect those dots again.
There's actually a question or a comment sort of in the chat about that. I'm trying to get back to it, but it says, how do we get some of what's being said today, these types of critiques and analyses? So Evelyn Tolliver said, it is very important that we support the president and vice president by attempting to set meetings with them to share critical conversations like what is happening right now in this webinar. But that makes me think about reaching folks outside of the academy, right? How do we do that? I mean, I think Zoom is opening up those possibilities in some ways, But, you know, if we want to influence policy or tell Biden you need to bring the climate change executive order and the racial equity executive order together, how do we go about doing that? So, I mean, several of you are public scholars. So do you see your public scholarship as a way to do that? What are your thoughts on influencing this administration? Because certainly progressive activists are geared up to do that. And I know that some of you are also activists. But how do we get these conversations beyond just this university community that we're often in conversation with or other academics?
I mean, one thing that I've been trying to make more of a concerted effort to do is I think it's good for academics like us to be more connected with organizers within the community. I think that's a important thing that certainly I would like to do a better job of, in terms of there are many people already doing a lot of this work that we're talking about in terms of trying to organize and push for certain kinds of public policy and change. It's important for us to recognize that that work is being done and see where we can use our voices. Certainly also public scholarship, op-eds, other kinds of public scholarship is also a good way to make sure our voices are heard. But I think it's more important, more than anything, it's important that we step out of the silo of the academy and dig into the community where people or groups have been doing a lot of this work for a very long time.
There's another question that came in. Says, our panelists have discussed how much of what we see today is a relic of the continuation of the Civil War. It seems to be like a cold Civil War that has been going on for the past 155 years. How do we end it?
Who's we?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, or how does it come to an end? I don't want to use the passive voice.
Yeah.
I don't want to use the passive voice, Professor Cottom. You'd mark up my paper. But how does it come to an end?
Break up with whiteness. that's how it ends. We break up with whiteness and see what happens next. Outside of that, I don't know that it comes to an end.
One of the things that I think it was Thurgood Marshall said this. He said, we have, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, we've had a civil war, we've had a civil rights revolution, we've had these major moments of sort of reconstruction, if you will, reorganization of the society, but the founding documents still describe enslaved people as 3/5 of the population, right? 3/5 of human. They still talk about the 1808 date, right? There's still references to the enslavement and constitutional oppression of Black people. We have yet to call a new constitutional convention with that includes the people who were excluded. So Black people, poor people, and women. And many areas those overlap. And is that the solution, right? Is that the solution to call for a reorganization of government? Not a revolution, not a violent overthrow, but a reorganization of government to reflect what we want a modern democratic republic to look like.
Ron, I'm gonna answer the original question. I'm not sure how well it speaks to the addendum. Look, the way that we've been taught and are teaching the Civil War in this country has changed dramatically in just the last 4 years. Compared to the Broads 150 years after the war, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, all those monuments, school textbooks. In the last 4 or 5 years, look, since Dylann Roof, since Charlottesville, it's already completely changed. It's very, very different conversation. It's, we've had to go through some things to get here, certainly, but it's different now. And I mean, we're still dealing with people like all three of the last major presidential candidates literally grew up during the era of Jim Crow, right? Before schools were even desegregated in places like North Carolina. And so it's going to take a little bit of time to end this Civil War in a different way. But we now have people in schools that are teaching Reconstruction and the Civil War completely differently, I think, than even just 6 or 7 years ago. And that's going to be something that's going to be, it's a grassroots educational effort, but I think it's there and it's happening.
Okay. I want to turn to a question from the audience, our colleague Lloyd Kramer in the Department of History. He says, the history of racist policing has created endless abuse and violence, but if the police are not a viable institution, what is the institutional counterweight to white supremacist groups who are armed to the teeth and ready to use guns against democratic institutions? And I might add, including many of those who are police officers. What is the best institutional defense against armed white mobs? And that's from Lloyd Kramer.
Okay, I guess I'm a little confused. What do we have now? I mean, who do I call now when the Ku Klux Klan shows up? The cops? I guess, yeah. Okay. Well, I do think that we've got like a theoretical question there and a more pragmatic one. The theoretical answer would be, if we take for granted the things that we have said to date, that the police have been infiltrated. So like if I assume that the institution of policing can have a different function than the one it has had historically and the one it continues to demonstrate itself to be contemporaneously, then it has reform potential to be a functional good. Then we say it has been infiltrated by white nationalists, as has the military. Then the question is, how do I call the police now on the police? If the white nationalists are the police, how do I call the police on the police? Practically, we really do not have a solution to that, which is quite frankly what so many organizers have been saying. You cannot call the police on the police, and that is the problem. So one of the things, and this is not me, I mean, these are things that I've learned from organizers and what they are proposing, is that you were never safe from police violence. You are never safe from police violence. It either just hasn't visited itself upon you yet, or you have not become enough of a threat for you to be enmeshed in the police state. But you are always subject to police violence and therefore are made vulnerable because the police state exists. And so what organizers have taught me is that the right question isn't who do you call on the police? The question is, how do we make it so that you don't need to call some external authoritative agency for your basic needs and well-being? I mean, if what we saw on January 6th was a complete failure of policing to police white supremacy. So that's, yeah, the idea that more police would be better presumes that what happened on January 6th was just what rote incompetence. And if that's what we're going to accept, then you mean to tell me that an institution that incompetent has that much firepower? That doesn't seem good either. So it seems to me we'd be almost saving the police from itself to take itself away from policing, because they shouldn't have all that firepower if it is that hard to police. I mean, so you just sort of get into these self-referential arguments and get into these loops. In the short term, what people have said is that you increase all of the institutional supports that policing has backfilled the gaps on. So police now do everything from responding to a sick child, an ailing elderly person, a lost animal or pet, a rock being thrown through a window, and that we should be able to imagine a society, as many other societies have, I might mention, like this isn't fantastical. Lots of people live this reality already, where you actually don't call the police for those things. We should, I would hope, at least be able to agree upon that. And then we would maybe be able to go, well, if we've got such a limited use case for police that we only use them when the white nationalists show up on public property, then we've got a very narrow, limited use case for the police. And I feel like we could have a more practical conversation.
Kia?
Well, I just want to thank everyone. Thank you so much to the attendees for your engagement. The chat, there has been a real conversation in the chat, and unfortunately I can't save it. Someone asked about saving it, sharing it. But, thank you everyone for attending on a Friday evening. Thank you to our panelists for just this amazing conversation. I hope that we can continue it as well. It has been recorded. It will be on YouTube, on the YouTube channel for AAAD. I did share that link and I'll share it. I'll try to share it again. And then I'll just turn it back over to Ron to close us out.
Yeah, just again, thank you to Professor Wilson, Professor Holland, Professor Sturkey, and Professor Cottom. Again, Professor Cottom, welcome to UNC. We're glad to have you here, and thank you so much for all of you for responding favorably to our request for this panel. I knew when we got these folks together, it will be a good discussion. We had 500 and some odd people registered. We had about over 300 in attendance. So this was an excellent turnout. Thank you to the audience for your questions and contributions to the discussion. Regretfully, we could not get to all of them, but we hope that you all got something from this, and we will be having more of these webinars over the course of the semester. We'll try to do 1 or 2 more and to keep these conversations going. They're important ones to have. And to the panelists, Kia sent an email with a link just for us to check in briefly afterwards for 10 minutes or so to say thank you and goodbye. So with that, we can end here. And thank you so much, everyone, for your participation. Good night.
Thank you.